Hi, I'm Stephanie Arnold. My near-death experience happened 4 years ago. I was pregnant with our second child, and at the time, I had had a baby before, and I had a C-section before. There were no problems, no complications. I gave birth at 41 weeks. I was back at work 8 days later. This was a little different. At 20 weeks at the ultrasound, I was diagnosed with a placenta previa, which is not abnormal. It's a 1 in 200 risk. Well, it's kind of abnormal, but 1 in 200 risk. Basically, the placenta is growing on top of the cervix. And the doctors just say, just take it easy. But at that moment, I told my husband and I told the doctors, I've got a very bad feeling about this. Well, that bad feeling turned into very detailed premonitions. I had a vision that my placenta previa was going to combine my cervix, or my uterus was going to combine with the placenta. I was going to hemorrhage. I was going to need a hysterectomy. I was going to be put under general anesthesia. The baby was going to be fine, and I was ultimately going to die. I am married to a PhD economist from University of Chicago. Telling my husband, boo? Did you say it's boo? He was a former Air Force pilot, very linear, very analytical in his thinking. And he's telling me, sweetheart, you're fine. And every time I would have these visions, I said, I'm telling you this is going to happen. And I'd go to doctor after doctor. I'd tell every single one of them. I'd tell the nurses. I'd have ultrasounds. Everybody was like, Mrs. Arnold, are you stressed? Maybe you need to rest. Maybe you need to sleep. And I said, no, I don't need sleep. I'm telling you this is going to happen. And so at one point, I sought out specialists. We were in Chicago giving birth at Northwestern. And I made an appointment with the head of gynecological oncology. Now, the reason I did this is that if you have a problem when you give birth and your OB can't handle an emergency operation and your life is at risk, they pass it on to maternal fetal medicine. Well, maternal fetal medicine doesn't have as much experience with high-risk patients having this kind in the reproductive organ side. So they told me that the person that handles the highest risk surgeries, especially when 20% of your blood supply is going straight to the uterus, would be a gyn-onc. So try and make an appointment with the head of gyn-onc at Northwestern Memorial Hospital when you don't have reproductive organ cancer and you're a healthy 7-month pregnant woman. It wasn't easy. And when I finally got the appointment, I'm sitting in the waiting room. My husband is like, honey, I'm embarrassed to be here. And I said, sweetheart, I don't know what to tell you because everybody is telling me there's nothing happening, but I still see it happening down the road. It's like I am the only one seeing this freight train about to hit me and everybody else sees a field of flowers. And so we get into the gyn-onc's consultation room. And there's a resident there, and she's taking notes. And he's like, how can I help you, Mrs. Arnold? I said, well, I have a placenta previa. It's going to turn into an accreta. I'm going to hemorrhage. I'm O negative, which is a very, very rare blood type. So you need to prepare the operating room, and you're going to give me my hysterectomy. And he's like, and the resident stops, and they look at me, and he says, have you been on the internet? Yes, I have, but this is going to happen. So cut to everybody telling me no, 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 no. And my husband saying, so the gyn-onc says, okay, well, maybe you should get an MRI. If the MRI is positive for what you think of this merger between the uterus and the placenta, then I'll schedule myself for your mandatory C-section and we'll do the hysterectomy there, no problem. And I felt better because all of a sudden I felt like I was being heard. So I go have the MRI. The MRI is negative for what I thought. So my husband says, you should feel better. I said, no, actually, I feel worse. Because I'm running out of people telling my crazy foreboding story to. So my gynecologist says, why don't you have a consultation with anesthesia? I said, why? I didn't have one before with my first child. And she says, well, it might help you think about what the process is going to be after you give birth. And I said, okay, fine. So I pick up the phone. I have the phone consult with a young fellow by the name of Dr. Grace Lim. And she's telling me what's going to happen, epidural, where you're going to recover, and all this. I said, that's great, except what happens if this, 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 and this happens? And she says, she stopped talking for a moment, and she hesitated, and she said, Mrs. Arnold, you're in a teaching hospital. You're in very good hands. Just please try to relax, and I hope I made you feel better. but I wasn't feeling better. So I took to Facebook. I said, if anybody has my blood type, I'm going to need it. I wrote goodbye letters. I sent out goodbye letters. I told people in those letters what exactly what was going to happen to me and how much I loved them and I cared for them. Come D-Day, 36 weeks pregnant, my husband's in New York, and I start bleeding all over the kitchen floor. So we get to the hospital. My friend's there with our baby, and she's 1.5 at the time. And, you know, I'm telling my doctor, I'm like, I really have a bad feeling about this. And she's like, Stephanie, I think you're just nervous because your husband's not here. I said, Julie, and she's now my friend. She's given birth, she's, delivered my first child. So, Julie, there's something wrong. You need to put me under general anesthesia. She says, Stephanie, I'm not going to do that because it's going to put the baby to sleep. You're fine. I promise you, you're fine. So she looks at my daughter and is like, Mommy's going to be back soon. I hug my daughter 1,000,000 times, kiss her. And as they're wheeling me out to the operating room, I break down crying because I know it's the last time I'm going to see her. I get to the operating room, and at that point, this is the operating room that's going to give life to my son and take mine. I was convinced. So I have an epidural in, I'm not going anywhere. An anesthesiologist once told me, like, if you were my patient, I wouldn't do the procedure. Hearing all the foreboding, I said, yeah, but this baby was coming out no matter what. So there's no way you're going to stop this from happening. So I'm in the operating room, and all of a sudden the nurses, the doctors, these voices are going faint, and they're asking, Mrs. Arnold, do you need a blanket? Mrs. Arnold, do you need anything? And I just disconnected at that moment. I gave birth to a very healthy baby boy, and 3 seconds later I was dead. So what happened? I had an amniotic fluid embolism, a very rare 1 in 40,000 risk where amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream, and if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into somewhat of an anaphylactic shock, and in most cases, women don't make it. I went into cardiac arrest. They intubated me, taped my eyes shut. I was having a C-section, so there was a curtain in front of my face. And that's when the fun began. My lungs shut down, and the body goes into full DIC. Your normal body has 20 units of blood. I was given 60 units of blood and blood product to save my life. The only reason I'm alive is that anesthesiologist didn't feel comfortable with how she left that phone call, and she said something told her to flag my file and incorporate extra blood and a crash cart in the operating room at the time of delivery. I go into full DIC. I get transferred to the surgical ICU. And that's when my husband arrives. He says to the nurses and the doctors, if she needs a hysterectomy, this is the doctor we met with 2 months before. It's like, Dr. Arnold, I don't think we're going to need that. She's stable right now, but it's touch and go, so we don't know what's going to happen. Everything's calm in the ICU. 7 hours later, they determine that I'm still hemorrhaging, and they call in the doctor I met with 2 months before to perform the hysterectomy. When they did the pathology on the uterus, they showed that merger between the placenta and the accreta, or the placenta and the uterus, had started to form. It was just microscopic, and they couldn't see it from the MRI. Medically induced coma for 6 days. I went into kidney failure. I started dialysis. And when they pulled me down off of the meds, I looked at my swollen belly, severe edema, and I said, am I still freaking pregnant? And my husband said at that point he knew I was going to be okay. I knew where I was, and I was cursing. So after a month in a hospital and physical therapy and dialysis and everything else, I come out of this, and every single doctor, and mind you, I'm in a teaching hospital, so I touched cardiology, nephrology, hematology, every nurse there, everybody was praying for me. I was one of the highest acuity cases at the time, and it was one person after another saying, do you know what a miracle it is you survived? God has a plan for you. Well, that wasn't making me feel very comfortable, and it wasn't helping with my recovery. So I sought therapist after therapist after therapist. And every time we'd start therapy, they'd say, so how can we help you? And I said, well, I need to understand how it is I saw everything in great detail months before it happened. They said, let's not worry about that right now. Let's just worry about getting you out of the trauma. I said, see, that does not help me, because what happens if I have another premonition? I told my story to a local CBS affiliate in Chicago. And the very next day, I was not prepared for what would happen the next day. The next day was the cover story of Yahoo globally. Then we were on Good Morning America. Then we were on Steve Harvey and the doctors and everything. And Steve said to me, he's like, did you see the light? I said, I don't know, man. They gave me a lot of drugs. I don't remember. And I thought it was, at that point, I wasn't after understanding about the near-death experience, because I was trying to get over the trauma, but I also was dealing with the premonitions. I had no idea that the premonitions at the time were connected to the NDE, which was very interesting for me, because this process has taken me on this kind of roller coaster ride, and I was determined to find out how the premonitions happened. And I write in my book, the book was published by HarperCollins, and it's called 37 Seconds. And in the book, I talk that I've had intuitive thoughts as a kid, but half of the time I was wrong. So the times that you were right, someone died. And when somebody died as a kid, as a 10 and 12-year-old kid, and you can see those things, you compartmentalize it and you do not talk about it anymore until it was your own foreboding. So I'm going to show you a clip. So what happened is through this process, I ended up finding a regression therapist. And if those of you don't know, a regression therapist uses hypnotherapy to take you back into those moments of trauma, to give you kind of a view as an observer into your traumas, and maybe to take you outside of it so that you can see, not that it wasn't bad, because it was bad, but that it can give you some sort of explanation that you can see something else going on. I wasn't expecting what would happen. I videotaped my therapy for two main reasons. One, I'm still to this day under neurological care, because the mind plays games on you when you're on barbiturates and been in a coma. But I didn't know if I would remember anything. And the second thing is I'm a little type A, if you can't figure that out. So I didn't want anyone tampering with my mind. And if they said chicken, I'd be walking like a chicken, so I'd never been hypnotized before. So what you're going to see is this split screen is one of my therapy sessions. I did 30 hours of therapy. I cut it down to 3.5 minutes that you're going to see 3 different clips. The first one is going to be at that moment that she finally got me to the operating room. And then you're going to see in the second clip a moment where I started seeing spirits. And then I will come back after that video and just explain to you what was verified through it all.
And I explained to Stephanie, it's going to happen very quickly, and I'm going to embrace you, and I'm going to hold on to you, and I'm not going to let go. Something came out of it. It came up, and my eyes rolled back, and my chest was out and stopped breathing, and I had a seizure. And I heard them screaming because they said, Stomach. And Nicole ran to the head of the bed. And she's turning blue, and the EKG machine went flat, and I was done. I love them very much, but I don't want to be there.
Is there any message they give you? They see you suffering. They know you're suffering. They know what you're feeling. Do they have any message for you?
My uncle since I've always known you to be a fighter. I've always known you to survive. You know what? He said you know what to do. But I need help. And he says you don't need help. You know exactly what to do. You've always known what to do. You knew what to do when you were telling the doctors. You know what to do now. No, when I was standing with my uncle, and he said you always knew what to do, and I turned around and I saw everything being done. And
so it's that realization that made you feel this way. It's
Yeah.
like seeing all the stuff that the body went through.
yeah.
But your body is so strong that whatever it was, it healed.
I need a drink.
Huh? Do you drink?
I drank heavily that night. So here's the thing. What was verified, I had 30 hours of this. So in this particular one, before the spirit side, I explained what was happening in the operating room after I flatlined. I explained that my anesthesiologist was by my feet. I explained who hit the button for the code. I explained who was the nurse that jumped on my chest and gave me CPR. I explained where the nurse's break room was on the surgical floor. I explained what my nanny was doing with my daughter at the time in the labor and delivery room. I explained what my husband was wearing when he got off the plane, coming into the hospital. So my husband, and there were a few other things, and so my husband takes a quick look at the first part of the therapy, and obviously as my husband, he slams the computer down, he's like, I don't understand why you're doing this. We're fine. Typical Air Force mentality, suppress, repress, let's move on, right? He's like, and besides, how do you know any of this is true? This could be a recalled episode of Grey's Anatomy in your head. So I said, you're absolutely right. So I called my therapist and I said, how do I know this is true? And she said, well, sometimes the only truth we get is that the patient feels better. That's the only validation we need. And I said, yeah, that doesn't work for me. I said, because there were a lot of witnesses of what I'm saying. So lucky for me, I had it on tape. It wasn't even hearsay of like, oh, let me recall the story and everything. So I brought the tapes back to the doctors and I videotaped the doctors while they were watching the therapy. And my one doctor says, I didn't go to medical school for this. I don't know how you know any of this. This wouldn't be in medical files. This isn't something I said, did the first crash cart attempt not work and the second one did? She's like, how do you know that? I said, and then this nurse walked into the room and she's like, Stephanie, Mrs. Arnold, you probably don't remember. I'm like, you're the one that broke my ribs. And she was startled by that. And as we were walking back, I said, is the break room right there? And they're like, yeah, but you wouldn't know that. And then I said to my gynecologist, I said, did you keep saying this can't be happening, this can't be happening? After all the months of me telling her that this was going to happen, did you keep saying that? She said, I did, but in my head. And then the kicker was for my husband, I said, our doctor didn't deliver the baby. He said, how do you know? I said, I saw it in my regression therapy. He said, oh, okay. He says, of course she delivered the baby. There was blood all over her scrubs. She was there. I said, I'm not saying she wasn't there. He's like, oh, well, then who delivered it? I said, the gyn-onc resident that was taking the notes delivered our baby. He said, why would the gyn-onc resident that was taking the notes be the one delivering the baby if she was on gyn-onc rotation? I said, I don't know. This is what I saw. He's like, okay, you're crazy. And so he's like, I want to listen to what your doctor's saying in person. I said, no problem. So I asked my doctor, I said, I just need to know if you delivered the baby. And Jonathan said, you did, right? You delivered the baby. And the doctor's like, no, actually, I didn't. And I said, was it the gyn-onc resident? And she looked at me perplexed. She said, how do you know that? At that moment, I had the answers I needed. I no longer question whether this is science or spirit that helped save my life.